Hello everyone, welcome to another one of my live streams, and today we're going to be talking about managing neurodivergent burnout. Now, first of all, apologies for the fact that this one's been a bit delayed. I was away. I hoped to be able to record some live streams whilst I was away, but that all got a bit ahead of me. So now I'm back, and we'll be back to the kind of hopefully the regular normal schedule of live streams from now on. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the experiences of burnout, why it happens, how it comes about, maybe how you can work to ease it. It's not always something that you can completely fix, but the ways you can work with it, manage it. And then we're going to answer community questions about the thing as well. And please do keep an eye on my LinkedIn feed, because there'll be community questions for the next topic as well coming up soon. So a little bit of a warning about the content. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the symptoms and consequences of burnout and why that can be difficult. So if that's something you're right in the midst of and it's too much to hear, then perhaps you don't want to listen to this right now. Please do ask questions as we go, and ask me any questions as you like, and I'll get to them if I can. Now, burnout is something I've definitely experienced and definitely kind of work on the edge of quite a lot. I really fully burnt out in 2018 and was actually really quite unwell with it without even realizing at that point that it was neurodivergent burnout. And I think that's a really difficult thing to work with if you happen to have encountered it as well. It can be a real shock. In some ways, it led to me finding out that I was neurodivergent and understanding the situation that I'd been in. Now, I want to talk a bit about how burnout shows up, because sometimes it's a bit different for neurodivergent people than it is for other people. Now, neurodivergent people are at significantly greater risk than the general population of burning out. And it's a real challenge for a lot of people. And I think it's also worth noting that it's not entirely like the burnout that some other people see, that neurotypical people might see, because it comes from different sources. And we'll talk about some of those a bit later. I want to talk about some of the warning signs and some of the ways it shows up, first of all, so maybe you can spot it yourself. Because like a lot of neurodivergent people, we're used to working very hard, we're used to struggling, and we're used to kind of being on the edge of some of this stuff. So it's not always, it can be hard to tell, okay, this is actually something that's not quite right. This is something that we could address. So the first bigger sign of burnout coming is needing a longer time to recover between things, finding that you need that relatively small things that would be, maybe have a little recovery time, get longer and longer. Maybe if it's interacting with people for you or being in very large, noisy, busy spaces, and normally you'd need maybe an hour or two to recover, suddenly you find yourself needing a day or two to recover. That might be something that's suggesting that maybe your resources are depleted. Another big area of this can be prioritizing the work that we need to do over other things, over fun things, over the things that we most want to be doing. And that can be a real issue too. And so when that starts to happen, we start to lose the joy in life, and the kind of sparkle goes out of things. And that can be another symptom of burnout. And maybe it's relationship to things like depression as well. But really keeping an eye on that. It's like, is this, am I losing the joy in this? And sometimes losing the joy in the work that we're doing as well, not getting what we want out of work anymore, can be another big sign of that. Another really obvious one, big one, is starting to get physical symptoms, kind of physical aches and pains that won't go away, maybe kind of digestive things, skin things, like the small things about how your body is working, and colds, and being more susceptible to coughs and colds as well. That's a really, really big one. I know a lot of people who are used to working quite close to this limit find that when they stop, they suddenly get a whole load of things. When they go on holiday, they suddenly get a cold, or, for me, sometimes it can be a migraine. It's also like the shock for my body is so used to working in tension and doing all this work that when it goes away, it almost goes into a panic mode and doesn't know what to do. So if you spot that, again, it's a sign that you're working close to these limits. And as well as the physical symptoms, you can get loads of psychological symptoms as well. And these can be increases in emotional reactivity. So finding small things really upsetting that wouldn't normally tip you into dysregulation, wouldn't tip you out of balance, but suddenly start doing so, or start to be this kind of ongoing irritation that you can't deal with, or that feels very uncomfortable. And the flip side of that is that you might also experience emotional detachment and numbing. That shows up as like not caring, not feeling that things matter anymore, that what you're doing matters anymore, or struggling to realize, struggling to care about what you're working with or the people that you're working with. Another big area that this shows up is the cognitive difficulties, memory difficulties, and brain fog. So that experience of just not being ever fully sharp, not being ever ready to kind of do what you need to do, is another big possible sign of impending burnout. And just more negative psychological symptoms in general. If you have neurodivergent symptoms that you manage, that you find difficult, and maybe that other people find difficult, then if you're getting closer to burnout, moving towards burnout, those symptoms might come to the fore more fully and be more disruptive. You just might not have the resources to handle them in the same way that you did before. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about why burnout actually happens, how it comes about, and the kind of issues that arise because of it. So one of the really big issues for neurodivergent people that causes burnout is masking. And higher masking people are at really, really high risk of this. It's a really, really significant issue. And it can lead to, the effort involved in managing others, managing the situation, holding all of that context all of the time, never being able to put it down. And in never being able to assert our needs and not resolving the conflicts that come about because of them are a really, really big challenge. And they can definitely lead to burnout because we never get the chance to down-regulate, to rest. Another big area that leads to this is this expectation that we over-deliver, this taught over-delivery that we can pick up. One of the big ones of this is this idea of doing your best, meaning, show up 100% all of the time. And that just isn't realistic. No one can do that. Your best is what you can achieve in the moment. But I think it's very easy to pick up this message that actually we should be on it all of the time. And that is exhausting and definitely leads to burning out. Another area of this, and related to this, is when we have really variable ability. Different situations, either externally or internally, mean we can perform differently and in different ways. But if that's not something that we are supported in or that's understood, that can really lead us to overperforming, to pushing, to trying to do this, even when we're not resourced to do so. Another area around this is hyperadaptation. And when we've got these hyperadaptations, they are really well practiced and we often aren't even aware that we're doing them, but they're still demanding, they're still taking a cost. And very often, if they're rooted in traumatic experiences and we haven't had the chance to unpick all of that, they can't always be moderated or turned off. So they're always costing us that thing when we're in that environment, whether or not they're kind of really relevant or useful right now. And that is another really, really big area that can be a challenge. Now, another aspect that can be a significant difficulty is just that we seek different rewards. The world isn't necessarily set up to reward us with the kind of things that we want. And being able to get those rewards can really be a source of, or the fact that we don't get those rewards or have to work very, very hard to get them can be a source of significant challenge as well. And related to this, and this is a really big thing that I see and I've experienced myself and I'm still working on, is that very early on we pick up the message that the things that we care about, the things that are intrinsically rewarding, that bring us joy just to do, are over here and are separate, and we need to keep them separate from the things that other people want to see and other people reward, or other people even find it acceptable at all. And because those things are separate, we are always working between burnout and between often bankruptcy at work. Now, I want to pause here because I've noticed one of the streams has disconnected, which is not very helpful. So I will stop and restart that stream. So that's unfortunate. Okay, so it looks like that's failed completely. So what I will do is I will share this. So if you're catching up on LinkedIn afterwards, yeah, this is where it broke. So this is where you can restart. Okay, so where were we? Intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. So yeah, so these intrinsic and extrinsic rewards are completely separate. And that's a really, really big issue because we're always being pulled between them. We can never satisfy both at once. And that learning to include those and join those back together means that we can use the resources that we have much more fully to meet both of those needs. And very often we only have limited capacities, and particularly if you have ADHD, you might find that you have very limited volitional capacity to do things that are a means to an end. And so kind of double dipping on the reward that we get is really, really important because you won't necessarily have the energy and the drive to do that next time. Another big area that can lead to burnout is invalidated needs. Now, this can come about because our needs might be different. We might be told that our needs aren't valid, even though they completely are. And that can really lead to us then not meeting those needs at all, or foregoing meeting those needs, or postponing them long beyond the time that we really would be in our interests to do so. This can lead to problems drawing boundaries, problems to saying no, problems to saying, sorry, not right now. That can be a really, really big issue. And the difficulty is when we override our boundaries, when we override our needs, eventually we get so depleted that we kind of end up in this panic response of being like, oh God, I need to do this. And then it becomes a huge thing and it becomes a real emergency. And so it can be a real thing for other people because suddenly they didn't know we had this need. And it's a huge thing all of a sudden. And so that itself can become problematic because we could have taken slightly smaller steps earlier on to meet that need without it becoming an emergency. Another area of invalidated need, which is a really big one at work, is the moral injury of working. Now, moral injury is this idea that we can live with, to some degree, things that don't align with our values and our system of morality. And particularly people who have a high justice sensitivity, and that's quite a lot of autistic people, some ADHD people and some others as well, will really suffer if our work isn't aligned with values and aligned with this high justice sensitivity. And that can be a sense of burnout because we're holding all of these different kind of paradoxical things that are really, really hard to reconcile and working around them all of the time without ever being able to resolve them. And I also want to say that, when we talk about masking, one of the things we learn to mask is the exhaustion itself, is the fact that we have needs that aren't being met. So it's very easy for us to appear absolutely fine to an outside observer, even though we're dealing with an awful lot and a lot that other people might find, someone else would find completely overwhelming. Now, that itself is an issue, and it's worth really remembering that your needs are, your own experience is the key thing to whether or not you have, whether or not you need to take breaks and where those needs are being met or not. And I want to just touch on the fact that particularly where things are trauma related, and this does cross over with the masking again, very often that means being hypervigilant, constantly looking out for a situation and never fully relaxing. And there's quite a lot of research to suggest that for many autistic people, just never ever settle down to the kind of same relaxed baseline that maybe many of the rest of the population do. So understanding that it can be really, really hard for us to relax, and we need very specific circumstances in which to do so. And that looking for those is really a very important way of managing the burnout that we're experiencing. So now I want to talk a bit about how we can manage this, how we can work with it. One of the key ways to understand how burnout happens is effort to payoff ratio. So it's not to say that we can't do hard things if we're at risk of burnout. Indeed, actually avoiding hard things can be a sign that we're in impending burnout. We want to be able to do challenging things. We want those things but we want to be able to do challenging things that give us what we need, and understanding that we're going to get a high payoff for those things as well. And that might be, that can be intrinsic or extrinsic, or ideally, as I said, both. But we still need to consider that we're going to get those needs. We're going to get those needs met. And so understanding where our particular effort payoff ratio is for doing different things in different circumstances is a really, really key way of starting to move things in a direction away from burnout. And another big part of that is the acceptance that we have a completely different set of abilities, or we may have a different set of abilities to most other people around us. And that has advantages and disadvantages. And a lot of the way that we can do this is by playing to our advantages, actually, and playing to the things where we find easy, we find straightforward, and we find fun. So looking towards how I can solve this problem, how I can achieve this in my way, with my abilities, is a really, really helpful way of working with burnout. One way you can think of a neurodivergent condition is as a specialism. And a specialism means, yes, developing skills in some areas, but implicitly it means choosing not to develop skills in others and being focused in a certain way. So thinking about how, with your particular special set of abilities, you can address and reach the things that you want is a really useful way of working with this. And another one, and this is a big one for me, is not chasing the losses hard. And when I say not chasing losses, this is something that gamblers might talk about. But actually, there are all sorts of losses that we encounter, things that didn't go as we planned, didn't work out. And particularly if you run your own business, this can be a huge thing. It's like, oh, I didn't sell it, I didn't get enough new clients this week, or I didn't do what I wanted this week. And we can be really, really hard and be like, well, okay, well, then I need to do extra next week, or I need to do extra tomorrow, or I need to not rest until I've done that. And that can be a real recipe for pushing ourselves beyond our abilities to cope and our boundaries ourselves. Another area to understand this is really to think about our sensitivity or our susceptibility, which is another word that psychologists sometimes use, and how that relates to the expertise that we have. Now, what I mean by this is if you are really sensitive to a certain thing, whether that's sensory or whether that's perceptive, whether you're really aware, if you're really aware of the sound of something, then you're actually likely to find really noisy spaces really overwhelming. If you're really sensitive to the energy that someone has and the way that they're feeling, then being in a space where a whole load of people are feeling bad is going to feel really exhausting and draining for you, as you need to boundary yourself and protect yourself and work with that. But the other side of that is being really sensitive to something gives you a degree of expertise to do fine work in certain situations that other people don't have. Because you're delicate, you're sensitive, is that you can work with this finely. But you've got to understand that comes with its own set of difficulties, and really understanding whether your work style in a context is more like a scalpel or an axe. It's a really important way to understand yourself and where the value of your work lies, because You wouldn't try and cut down a tree with a scalpel. It doesn't make sense. It would go blunt. It just doesn't work. And equally, I would hope you wouldn't try and perform surgery with an axe. So it's those kind of things. Where do you fall on this susceptibility, sensitivity, and allowing yourself what you need to support the degree of sensitivity that you do have is a really important way of avoiding burnout. I want to just talk about one of the ideas that I came across recently, which I think I'm not 100% comfortable with the whole thing, but I think it's a useful prompt, a useful consideration, a useful way of considering where you might be missing a certain sort of rest or perhaps recreation or recovery. And this is based in the work of Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. And there's a TED Talk and stuff in the resources if you want to follow this up. But in her talk and in her work, she identifies these different areas: physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, sensory, social, and creative forms of rest, and says that we need rest across all of these. So if you're feeling, that all of your rest is just sat there and is very passive and you're not getting the chance to do some of these other things, you might find that actually focusing on something, one of these other ones, is a useful way of getting the kind of rest and recovery that you need to move forward. Another way to work with this is to look at the stuff that you just kind of can't help but do. We often learn as neurodivergent people that a lot of what we're rewarded for is based on performance, is based on kind of not being exactly who we need to be in this push and this needing to be different. But actually seeing if we can focus our work and move to a place where we're valued for kind of who we are intrinsically, and the stuff we almost can't help but do is really, really valuable. So to give you an example, I have throughout my entire life often got into a lot of trouble for asking difficult questions of people, at school, at work. It was always a thing. It's like, why do you ask so many questions? Why are they so, people take offense at it. But now, because of the way that I frame my work, that's actually the thing that people are looking for me to do. That's what people ask me to do. They want me to ask those difficult questions and to unpick this stuff. So because I couldn't help but do it, it's actually really good, because that's intrinsically rewarding for me. I love doing it and I'm drawn towards it. So finding the kind of stuff where what are you drawn towards? What can't you help but do is a really, really helpful way of connecting these things up. Another way of doing this is is abandoning this idea of work-life balance and this idea that these things are separate. This is very often a very difficult thing for neurodivergent people to do anyway. I just don't think it's a helpful concept for us to reflect on. So rather than thinking about work-life balance, think about integrating work with all of the other aspects of your life. What is it? How does it fit? How does it work together, rather than this idea of two things in constant opposition? They should support each other rather than being two things like you trading off one against the other. Now, another area of this is the extent to which we have autonomy, we have control. And very often it can feel like we don't have control and autonomy. And this itself is really exhausting, because we're always at the mercy of other people. So it's really important to see what does autonomy look like for you? How does it feel to have more control? How does that actually feel like a good thing? Or are there areas that you'd like to give over control to other people? You wouldn't like a responsibility you don't want. Because both of those can be sources of burnout and of struggle. Now, the last thing I'd like to finish on before I move on to the questions from the community is that you are entitled to your needs. The message we get is that we're not entitled to our needs. The invalidation of needs that I mentioned earlier means that we tend to assume that our needs aren't really true, or there's different ways of, that we shouldn't be having them, that they're shameful, or at best, that we have to earn them, that unless we do a certain thing and we perform a certain way, we need to earn our needs being met. And that's a really, really tough thing to live with. And it's a recipe for burnout. So to work with this and to move this in a different direction, practice drawing good boundaries. And the easiest way to start with this is to practice drawing them with yourself very often, rather than with other people, because that can be difficult and has interpersonal stuff. But where can you is it, if you're tired and you're working, it's like, and particularly if you work for yourself, can you take a nap? Just 10 minutes or 15 minutes. That's all it takes very often. And then you'll probably do more afterwards anyway, be more productive rather than forcing yourself through all the time. So how can you achieve what you want without all of that pushing, and respecting your needs and your boundaries as you go? And another big thing around this is stopping before we're exhausted. Really making sure that you're taking regular breaks, you're building in this recreation in whatever way, and the rest that you need in whatever way you need. I know some people who schedule everything, and I'm kind of one of those people really. If it isn't in my calendar, I tend not to do it. So I schedule breaks, and I schedule lunchtime, and I schedule all of the other stuff that I know I need to be able to work all the way through and not be exhausted by the end of the day. So really understanding what are your needs in this, and stopping before you're at that you're on 1%, before you're running on fumes. You can stop at it's perfectly fine to stop at a quarter tank or a third tank or even half a tank, instead of pushing it all the way every time. And so related to that is attending to the early warning signs that you are getting tired, that you are in need of rest, of doing something different, and responding to them in ways that feel good and that work for you. So I'd like to kind of come to the end by asking a few community questions, and these were answered on LinkedIn. So it's really good to see that people have come up with a couple of these, and I definitely resonate with both of these. So I really wanted to share them. The first one is how to have rest that isn't productive. And I think this is such a big challenge for those of us who are kind of optimizers and systematizers. We want everything to work really, really well. And it can also be an aspect of us feeling that rest is scarce. You've got to make the most of this thing, because you don't have much of it. And that relates to those needs that I was talking about earlier. So that, look for that in yourself. If you're worried about the fact that rest isn't productive, or isn't restful enough, or isn't doing enough, then look and see how you're relating to your needs. One of the big areas that I find really useful is this idea of maximization versus satisficing. Now, satisficing is a weird word. It's not a very nice word, honestly. It's a portmanteau. And this idea that actually what's good enough is a really helpful way to look at this. And I see a lot of people, it's this idea of if you think about a holiday, is the holiday going to be most enjoyable if you plan everything out optimally, as optimally as you can, and insist on doing it? Whatever the weather does, whatever you feel like, whatever that in its way is actually really draining very often, and isn't going to give you the kind of rest you need, even though it might be the optimal way to do that holiday. Instead, thinking about what's good enough, what's going to feel good for you and in the moment, and what's going to meet the need well enough, is a really important thing. And this can also cross over with sleep. And for a lot of people, actually, I should have mentioned, insomnia can be an aspect of burnout. And really that idea of good enough sleep, I can get enough sleep, can be much, much more effective than the idea of I need exactly this amount of sleep, which can get in the way itself of getting the sleep that we need and the rest that we need. So really thinking in terms of this satisficing what's good enough, not what's perfect, is a really important way of dealing with that idea that rest isn't productive enough. And another one is, so thank you, Jackie, for that. And from David, we've got how to truly rest and do nothing without feeling guilty. And the guilt is a huge one, and again is related to this idea that we've been taught that we shouldn't rest, or that our rest wasn't allowed, or wasn't in the forms that were allowed. And I think for me, the big thing to deal with this, or the big reframe to deal with this, is that rest is part of the overall process. Is think in terms of what your whole process is of coming up with something. Some of it is doing, some of it is active, some of it is output, but some of it is daydreaming. Particularly, again, if you have ADHD traits, that mind wandering is actually a part of how we solve those problems. That idea of like, okay, I've kind of primed my brain to work on this in the background, and now I'm going to do something completely different. Because think about where you have your best ideas. I'll bet very often they're when you're in the shower, or when you're going for a walk, or when you're doing something completely unrelated to whatever it is that you're doing, or cooking dinner, or whatever. Then allowing yourself that rest, that nothingness, is as a part of the process. And another thing related to this is allowing yourself the kind of recreational input, is allowing yourself to read, is allowing yourself to listen to podcasts or watch TV that's going to generate the kind of ideas that are going to then serve you in whatever it is that you're trying to do and trying to achieve. So allowing yourself all of these different things and not seeing just output as the only thing that's valid and the only thing that's part of what you're doing. So I hope that was useful, and I hope it's going to ease the burnout that maybe you've been experiencing or struggling with a bit. The next topic we're going to talk about is when people get upset with you. And this is obviously going to cross over because there's stuff around needs and asking for needs and asserting needs in this one. So why, working with, why people might get upset and how you can work with that and how you can avoid that as much as possible in future. The notes for this and the transcript will be available on the website, so you can look up the resources that I mentioned, and there are links to all of those. And I'll have a transcript up for this on the website. If you have found this useful and you think maybe you want to work with me around some of this stuff, I have packages for neurodivergent business owners and for individuals working in organizations available, and a range of packages that are, we've had available for a few months now, and really good to see lots of people taking them up and going with them. So they're about finding the right support and creating the right situation that you need to be to do, really work at your best and to feel supported and not burn out. I've also got some new products for businesses and for organizations coming out soon. One of those is a policy review to check that your policies are neurodiversity friendly and are going to support neurodivergent people and aren't unintentionally excluding people. Another one is to help your whole organization talk more confidently about neurodiversity, because I found that a lot of what really makes managers, leaders worried about this is that they don't have the language and they're afraid of saying something wrong and afraid of saying something offensive. So really being able to talk about it confidently is a core way of making sure that everyone can get their needs met. And the last one of these is helping set up employee resource groups or employee groups around neurodiversity and disability. I know a lot of organizations have kind of something in place for other groups, but are just exploring this, and it can be a difficult thing, and it's not fair to put the burden of setting all of this stuff up on the people that you try to support in the first place. So I've got this offer around supporting setting up these employee resource group for your neurodivergent staff and to support your neurodivergent staff. And there's a discount on these products for Joyfully Different members and for community interest organizations. So don't feel that money is necessarily going to be a barrier to working with me. And if you happen to be around in London next week, I'm also going to be speaking at PropTech Connect, which is a really big conference around property and technology and innovation and building and design. So if that's your area, then please do check that out. Come along. That was a lot of stuff. So I very much hope to see you again soon. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.